Ladies and gentlemen, your keynote speaker, Zach Yaskell.
I just want to say welcome to all of you. Thank you for staying late on a Sunday afternoon. I hope that at least some of you are on spring break tomorrow. And before I begin, I wanted to thank Mike, Danny, Mike, Danny, Marisol, and everyone else at CUE for hosting me and for putting on yet another awesome summit and academy. So let's go ahead and get started. This is Castlemont High School in Oakland, California. Anybody from Oakland here? Awesome. On an average day in 2004, when I was a teacher there, about 20 of 30 of my students would show up for class, and it was a different 20 every day. At the end of the 4 years, only 20% of my ninth graders would actually go on to graduate. This is Bernard. Bernard is from the Ivory Coast. He was a refugee from the Ivory Coast, lived in Liberia for 10 years, and finally was one of only a handful of kids that made it to the US. He was resettled in East Oakland, and he landed in my Algebra 1 class about 2 months into the school year. He hadn't been in school since first grade, and his accent was so strong that for a long time I thought he was from a country called Africos that I had never heard of because I couldn't understand that he was saying Ivory Coast. A month later, 2 more students from Liberia arrived in the same class. Bernard and Samuel were also refugees and were so malnourished that they were about this big. They were about the size of 4th graders, but in high school. They could almost count to 10, but they didn't know how to add. And that first day when they came to my class, I was given no warning. They just showed up at my door, and I did the best thing I could. I put them on the computer at the back of the room while I went on to teach my class. And Samuel and Beatrice had never seen a computer before. They didn't know how to read. They didn't know what the internet was. 5 minutes later, Brianna, one of my best students in the back of the room, raised her hands, and she said, Yaskell, I think the new kids are watching porn. So just think about that for a second. This kid had never interacted with a computer before, didn't know what the internet was, and yet he was able to find out exactly what a 14-year-old boy was looking for. He didn't even know enough to know that it wasn't okay. But Sam and Beatrice were tenacious kids, hard-working students. Bernard, in particular, was one of the most perseverant kids I'd ever met. In my second year teaching, I was given a classroom with 32 refurbished desktop computers. It was 2004 or 2005, so they were mostly Gateway 2000 machines from 1997. Not the best machines you've ever seen. Long before Chromebooks. I'd always been a geek, and I was willing to try almost anything in my class. In particular, I was excited about trying a new program called Cognitive Tutor. Here's an old screenshot of Cognitive Tutor. You'll recognize its defining characteristics in lots of programs like it today. It was blended learning, so you did some days on, some days off. It had about 50 levels, and you had to master skills at each level before moving on to the next. It personalized to your needs, so if it gave you more problems if you didn't understand the fundamental concepts. After a few months, we started to see some interesting results. 6 students in my Algebra 1 class were brand new immigrants from Mexico. They didn't speak a word of English. And as you can see from the screenshot, every problem in Cognitive Tutor is a word problem. And they were able to use pattern matching to pull out the relevant facts and solve the problems, even though they didn't know what the words meant. A pair of twin boys hadn't passed a math class since 5th grade. And they only came to school like once a week when they felt like it, and they started coming to school every Tuesday and Thursday, Cognitive Tutor days, only during my second period class, and then they started coming during lunch, and then they started coming after school, because they were so competitive with each other. Bernard worked harder at it than anybody. He came every day after school, 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes 4 hours. By the end of the year, he had passed almost twice as many levels as the next highest student in the class. My first year teaching, before Cognitive Tutor, only about 29% of students at Castlemont passed the CASE, the high school exit exam. My second year, with Cognitive Tutor, over 80% of my students passed the CASE, including Bernard. I was a better teacher, but not that much better. 2 years later, Bernard went on to graduate near the top of his class. So in the right educational environment, technology can engage students in a powerful and fundamentally different way. That's the point of that story. As a teacher, it gave me superpowers. In a classroom with 43 students, I was able to reach all of them and meet their needs. So I like to think of tech in schools as a good news, bad news joke. The good news, tech can unlock incredible educational opportunities. The bad news, tech sometimes sucks. For example, to get to that place of opportunity with Cognitive Tutor, I had to spend hours every day making sure the computer still worked. Usually some of them were down or broken, or they needed me to remove stuff that students had downloaded onto them. There were network problems all the time. Students couldn't log in. And more than a couple times, students would remove all the S's from all the keyboards in the room just to screw with me. So even though we hate to admit it, teachers who are skeptical of tech and education sometimes have a point. They're not entirely wrong. Too often, tech is too hard to use in a school environment, and there are too many things that can and will go wrong. And tech for tech's sake doesn't serve anybody. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. 1, what is the role of tech in education? 2, how should we build tech products for schools? And 3, what it means to be on the fault line where education and technology collide. So I hope it's not too close to home for earthquake references. We all know, especially most of you from California, what fault lines are all about. They're the boundary where great change and great transformation happens, where mountains are made and landscapes are redrawn. When I left Castlemont, it was only 2006, but it was already clear that technology was going to radically reshape the education landscape, and I wanted to be part of it. Today, I feel really lucky to be the product manager for Google Apps and Google Classroom. It took me 10 years, but I finally got to be back where I wanted to be in the first place, building tech for schools. In the 8 years since I left the classroom, the world had changed. Here's an example. This is St. Peter's Square in 2005 as Pope John Paul was laid to rest. Here's the same shot of St. Peter's Square 8 years later as Pope Francis was announced. And I'm sure you've heard lots of people talk about how schools haven't changed enough, that our classrooms today look much like they did 50, 60, 100 years ago. And if you give presentations about education technology like I do, you probably have a slide just like this. If you don't, you can use this one. The summary is that tech changes fast, thank you, Gordon Moore, and education often changes slowly. I think 3 key factors, though, are accelerating the tech changes today. 1, devices are getting cheap enough and easy enough to manage at scale that one-to-one deployments are finally possible. The one-to-one classroom I had a long time ago, not manageable. 2, getting high-speed bandwidth for a school no longer requires rewiring the entire building. And 3, we paid over $40 per student for Cognitive Tutor. That was our whole budget. Now, teachers can get the majority of the tools and content that they use in their classes for free or much lower cost. So when I started visiting schools again in 2013, I saw that some schools were changing extremely quickly. They didn't look like these 1940 classrooms at all. They didn't look like any classrooms I'd ever seen. But even in those transformative schools, there was a spectrum of tech adoption. While some teachers were experimenting, some great teachers were choosing not to adopt tech for really good reasons. One of those teachers, my wife, thanks for joining me, is a high school English teacher. And these school visits, these conflicts were top of mind for me when I became the product manager for Apps for Education 2 years ago. In some ways, I think the job of a product manager is actually quite similar to that of a teacher or a school administrator. My job is to shepherd engineers all day, trying to turn ideas into useful products. And your job is to shepherd young minds into capable problem solvers, strategic thinkers, and future leaders. We all spend a lot of our time trying to understand our users. Your users are your students. We all spend a lot of time trying to solve problems and fight fires a lot of the time. And with our 120% time, our nights and weekends, we reflect on what worked and what didn't work. We reinvent our systems and our processes, and we learn from people who are doing our job in better and different ways than we are. As a teacher, there's never enough time to perfect your classroom systems. Instead, you're in an endless dance of reinvention and redefinition. The same is true of tech products. We launch and iterate and iterate and iterate. So aside from the fact that your job is way, way harder than mine, we're basically the same. When I moved over to Apps for Education, my first mandate as product manager was to do some research and figure out what we should do. You see, Google had been giving Apps for Edu away for free for 6 years. And as a free set of excellent tools, Gmail, Calendar, Docs, Drive, Sheets, Slides, Groups, and Sites, apps had been transformative for thousands and thousands of schools. But Google had rarely asked schools what they wanted or needed, or tried to understand their challenges. So as I began to think about what Google could and should do in the education space, I began to grapple with some fundamental questions. Most fundamentally, what's the role of tech in education? Why is there resistance to tech in schools? How should we design products for schools? How much of our own beliefs and opinions should inform those product designs? And as a tech company, what's Google's responsibility to schools? Today, I'll talk about our process grappling with those questions. I'll talk about some of the principles that guided our answers, and I'll talk about how they inform the development of Google Classroom. But before I go any further, how many of you know what Classroom is? Raise your hands. Excellent. How many of you tried Google Classroom? Excellent. And how many are only here today on a Sunday afternoon because you're hoping to get in a feature request before I leave? I expected everyone to raise their hands. For those of you who don't know what Classroom is, it's a new tool designed to save teachers time and make it easier to use tech in your schools. It's brand new. It's only 7 months old, so if you haven't heard of it, it's understandable. And we're just getting started, so expect more, a lot more from us. So because I saw some folks not raise their hands, I'm going to give a super quick overview of Classroom. So I like to say it does 3 things. It improves communication in the class so that teachers can make announcements, ask questions, students can communicate with each other, and overall make it so that you can have a dynamic classroom online. The second, you can create and collect assignments paperlessly. Students can do their assignments in Drive, Docs, or other web apps and turn them in paperlessly. And you, as a teacher, can see who's done it, see who hasn't done it, and give feedback in real time. And third, it helps keep everyone organized, which is half the battle. Students have an assignments page where they can see everything that they have to do coming up. Teachers have an assignment page where they can see how many students have and haven't done all the assignments and which ones they still need to grade. And everyone's Google Drive is automatically organized with folders for every class. So that's Classroom. If you want to see a demo later, I'm happy to show you. So back to that first question. What is the role of tech in education? Big question. One Silicon Valley view, I know we're not that close to Silicon Valley, is that tech should revolutionize education. It should disrupt education. It should transform the classroom. And when you talk with enough computer scientists about what they think that means, you realize that many of them would be happy with a future where robots did the teaching directly. In some ways, that's kind of what tech provided for Bernard. As far as I'm concerned, tech rescued him. Without it, he would have been lost and never would have graduated. He definitely wouldn't have learned algebra nearly as well. Or if I had been an awful teacher and he needed a way out, which is actually kind of true. Or if he'd been too far ahead instead of too far behind. But even though using tech as a teacher supplement is powerful, the Classroom team likes to approach this question, what is the role of tech in education, a little bit differently. In our research, before we launched Classroom, we saw 4 things, none of which I expect to be a surprise to any of you. 1, that teachers fundamentally love their jobs and they care deeply about their students. 2, that busy work often gets in the way of doing what they love. In particular, most teachers have a special place in hell reserved for the copy machine. 3, that instead of making things easier, tech often makes them harder and it gets in the way. And 4, that great teachers are always adapting their practice. So instead of trying to replace teachers with robots, we decided to give teachers superpowers. Instead of trying to define the disruption we want to see in schools, we instead decided to focus on tech that made it easier for teachers to do their jobs. Our hypothesis was that if we were able to build simple tools to give teachers and students time back, to keep them organized and efficient, then they'd be able to use that extra time to do the stuff that they're good at. At its simplest, education is about teachers and students communicating. At my alma mater, Williams College, we used to talk about James Garfield, who said that the ideal classroom is a professor at one end of a log and a student at the other end. That's old and powerful technology. Discussion, feedback, idea sharing. We wanted to build tools that help teachers do more of that, communicate more effectively with students. So our team isn't trying to revolutionize education. We're trying to empower teachers with the right tools so that they can revolutionize education. The second question we grappled with was what design model to follow. How should we build tech products for schools? One assumption about the right way to do it is that you should go away, design something awesome, refine it until it's perfect, and then bring it into the world. Think Apple. In a room 452 miles from here, there's an awesome group of people building the new gorgeous thing that everyone will be clamoring to buy in 2 years. But I think it's an unrealistic model for education. Teaching is unpredictable. It's improvisational. It's fundamentally imperfect. And it's relentless. Apple launches a new product every 2 years. As a teacher, you launch a new product every day. You're in a constant process of tweaking, adapting to student needs, and revisiting and redesigning your educational practice. That's more true today than ever before. So on the fault lines where tech and education collide, what education looks like is changing so quickly that today's educators need to be incredibly adaptable. And the tools we build have to adapt to their needs. One way that Google adapts to a rapidly changing environment is by focusing on the user. Throughout this next section, remember that anytime I say user, you can think students. Your users are your students. So what does focus on the user mean? It means we need to deeply understand user problems before we try and solve those problems. It means you have to talk to your users. You have to watch them, understand what they do, understand what frustrates them. And it means you're not the expert. Your users are. This principle is called user-centric design, and it's a big part of Google's culture. It's actually our #1 product rule. Before we built Classroom, before Classroom was even an idea on a brainstorm Post-it note, we spent months doing school visits, talking to teachers, and understanding where they struggled, what they loved, and how they developed workarounds. Here's an example from a second grade classroom of a workaround, where a teacher was trying to explain to her students how to turn in assignments on Drive. It's amazing and insane. So instead of our team going into a room somewhere and building a perfect product, we built a prototype that we hoped would solve problems like this. And then we gave that first prototype to 3 schools. We threw it over the fence. We didn't give them any instructions or training, and we watched what happened. This is what the prototype looked like. We learned a lot of things from those pilot teachers and students. We learned that some of our assumptions were wrong, but some were right. After a month, the teachers and students using that prototype were still using it nearly every day. And at the end of the month, when we told them, okay, the prototype's over, we need it back, they asked us not to take it away. One assumption that we had was that most teachers would use the tool to communicate with students outside of class. But on the first day of observation, Ms. Cohen had her 8th grade class conduct a silent debate using the comments thread of a post. Because Classroom didn't auto-update at the time, The kids were furiously pressing refresh so that they could see the latest comments from their peers and compose their brilliant responses before someone else typed the next thing. Turned out Classroom was actually being used in the classroom, which meant we as a team had to totally rethink. Later in that same pilot, Miss Marinello's 10th grade class was working in a computer lab. But towards the back of the room, a few students were on their phones. We figured they were goofing off. So we walked to the back to see what they were doing, but they were actually working on the assignment. And note, the prototype wasn't optimized for mobile at all. The mobile interface was awful. Students were scrolling and pinching and trying to just see the text. And so we asked one student why she was using her phone to type a 250-word response. And she crossed her arms and looked at us like we were a little crazy and said, autocomplete. It's way faster for me to type on my phone. So we knew that we needed mobile, but we didn't know how badly we needed it. But it turns out that focusing on the user isn't always easy. We're all educators and we all have opinions. I'm a former teacher. Our engineering lead is a former professor, and most of the people on the classroom team are former educators or are married to current educators. And on the team, we spend a lot of time arguing passionately about education and the best way to do things. But as we visited schools, we saw that effective teaching could be based on a variety of approaches. Different models worked at different schools. So we decided that we didn't want teachers to have to fit their teaching to our tools. And as you probably know, most Google tools are general enough, flexible enough that they can work well in many different environments. Take Google Docs, for example. It's been used to co-write novels with authors on different sides of the country, and it's used to write poetry in second grade classes. So although Classroom is targeted as a much more specific use case, we tried, as much as possible, to avoid baking any specific pedagogy into the product. But to be honest, one of the things that most concerns us about Classroom is that, at least right now, it's a more traditional model. Teacher gives the same assignment to the whole class, and each student turns their work into the teacher for feedback. Lots of teachers have found other ways to use it, but that's basically what it does. But when we went into schools and really focused on understanding user needs, on focusing on the user, we saw that teachers weren't clamoring for a revolutionary tool. They needed a way for students to hand in their homework. So our first launch of Classroom was us waging war on the copy machine, trying to save extra minutes and help teachers go paperless, knowing that teachers would figure out how to use those extra minutes in more innovative ways than we could. Next year, expect to see a lot of changes to Classroom based on what we've heard from teachers like you and from what we've seen teachers doing to adapt Classroom to meet their needs. Now, our team gets hundreds of feedback reports every day, mostly feature requests. Yes, co-teacher, we know. We read every one of them, and we use them to identify the big needs and opportunities. And we do user studies for every new feature, where we bring teachers and students into Google to test out the features before we build them, make sure they're perfect. And of course, the community of Google certified teachers, including many of the folks here, are at the forefront of much of the feedback that we get. You're our trusted advisors, our pilot users, and arguably the most powerful resource we have. Thank you for everything that you do. A few weeks ago, an engineer who had recently joined the Classroom team asked me a simple question. What does success look like in 5 years? I'll give you the answer I wish I had given him. The truth is, I don't know exactly. This whole tech space is changing so fast that 5 years is an eternity. Google is only 17 years old. The iPhone is only 7 years old. Classroom is only 7 months old. But I know a few things. I know that the opportunities that tech provides are inarguable. There are lots more one-to-one teacher and student interactions possible. Real-time collaboration and in-product feedback is way more possible. Teachers can easily reuse their materials since everything is digitally archived. Students are more engaged. There are a lot of personalized, self-paced learning tools that adapt to student needs. And collaboration and best practice sharing among teachers with communities of teachers at your school, at your district, or around the world is now more possible than ever. But like I said, tech today is still too hard to use in schools, and there's too many things that can and will go wrong. So even though we hate to admit it, some of the EdTech skeptics often have a point. I admit it, honey. You're sometimes right. Let's use another technology as an example. 7 years ago, I didn't have a smartphone. Most of you didn't either. Today, I habitually pat my pocket every time I stand up. Sometimes you feel the phantom vibrations. We no longer bat an eye when our phones give us turn-by-turn walking directions, or beam music wirelessly to Bluetooth headphones, or tell us where we are from satellites. These technologies are addictive because they're so useful. They solved real problems. They made life easier, and they made it possible to waste hundreds of hours playing Candy Crush. Soon, walking into a classroom without tech will be like leaving home without a smartphone. Imagine with me a future in which tech in schools is so simply and reliably enabling of better teaching, learning, and outcomes for every teacher, not just the best ones. Imagine a future where using tech is such an obvious choice that we forget there was a time when so many of us, including many of us here, were skeptics. And imagine that we've made it past the fault lines and we're into the mountain building phase. So, how do we get from here to there? I think we have to do the things that I talked about. 1, we have to give teachers superpowers, empower great teachers to revolutionize how education works. 2, we have to focus on the user, understand teacher and student problems, and then co-design solutions that solve those problems. So instead of saying, we have this cool tool, figure out how to use it, say, what problem can I help with? One last story for you. This is Sister Rosemary. When we did that pilot that I told you about, we didn't train any of our teachers because we believe that if the product wasn't easy enough to use, wasn't easy enough to figure out without any training, then it was too complicated. Sister Rosemary is 83 years old. She's been teaching for 62 years without any technology. We asked her school to participate in that pilot, and we sent them a Google form at the end of the first day to see how it went. Question number 1, what did you do when you went to classroom.google.com? Sister Rosemary responded, I clicked the plus button and created my first class. Question number 2, what did you do next? Sister Rosemary responded, I went to church and prayed that I'd be able to use the tool. When we visited her school a week later, Sister Rosemary was in the teacher lounge showing other teachers how to use Classroom. So, it's not necessarily going to be easy, and it'll take a lot of great teachers to help chart the course, to reinvent and revisit old solutions and systems. But as Teacher Rosemary says, if you've seen our video, you can't stay in teaching and stick to the old ways. As leaders in your schools, you're constantly designing and redesigning new products for your classroom and schools, whether they're lesson plans, unit plans, tech rollouts, or professional development days. As fast-moving tech and slow-moving education collide, you're all in a constant process of creation and recreation, of adaptation and revision. And the only way to navigate those changes is to decide what matters. So ask yourself, how can you use tech to empower great teachers rather than replace them? How can you involve your users, your students, and your colleagues in the process of designing an effective learning environment by asking for feedback and talking about their needs? Can you be relentless in your pursuit to solve problems with tech, not create new ones? So we may not be able to convert every skeptic, and maybe we shouldn't. They're helpful reminders of the work we still have to do. But if Sister Rosemary can adapt and use new technologies in meaningful ways, then anyone can. She makes believers of us all. Thank you.